Thanks very much, Kieran. Thanks very much, Kieran, and hi everybody. Delighted to have an opportunity to share some insights from my recently completed research. I'm just going to try and bring up presentation now, so if you could bear with me for a moment. So we'll just bring this up. Can everybody see that? Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, and everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
So thanks very much. Yeah, so as Kieran says, I'm just going to set a little bit of the context before we hear from Hussein and Anne, who, but you'll, as the presentations emerge, I think you'll see some interesting linkages. I suppose I'm interested, my own research was conducted a couple of years ago, but it looked at particularly around policy narratives and the implications for pastoralism in the drylands, and with a focus on Kenya and Ethiopia. So in this, I'll just present some results and some insights from that research. I'll say a little bit about why I think the research was important, why it has validity. I'll very briefly mention the methodology that for those of you who are interested, that in itself could be a presentation, and I'll just draw some insights and conclusions. So just bear with me for 1 second. So I suppose, I mean, just to say, and I mean, some of you might be familiar with this already, but we know for decades, you know, dominant dryland narratives around, for example, tragedy of the commons, desertification, indeed overgrazing, have underpinned a lot of development policies and interventions. And I suppose have done little to strengthen pastoralist livelihoods. And at worst, they've even led to displacement and marginalization. In recent years, I guess the state in Ethiopia and Kenya, for example, and their development partners have sought to respond to new concerns, particularly around climate change, food security, and political security. And I would argue that building resilience has become the overarching discourse by which the state attempts to mobilize resources or build consensus in these what were considered as peripheral dryland areas up until relatively recently. So while this discourse of building resilience in a way is welcome because it mobilizes or it gives new impetus to pastoralist development, some commentators in the literature have suggested that even though the language has evolved, some of the narratives driving these new climate change or green economy policies as they apply to dryland areas is not necessarily new, but instead rooted in historical discourses around unproductive drylands and the need for modernization. So I was interested, sorry, bear with me. Yeah, I was interested to explore whether these arguments hold up. I mean, so much so that, bear with me, yeah. So some in recent years have argued in the light of droughts in the Horn of Africa and so on, that we're in a period where we see the end of pastoralism. That pastoralism is no longer viable. You know, it's something that's just not tenable anymore because of fragmentation, because of droughts. And these are images I think that will be familiar to most of us from agencies in their advertising or indeed from media reports. Conflict, people queuing for food aid and so on. And these images in a way hide what I would say is a much more heterogeneous picture of pastoralism and dryland areas. And for many scholars have identified for a number of years, so while the media and the NGOs in a way are presenting a particular image, dryland scholars have identified, and pastoralists themselves have identified that mobile livestock keeping in fact is the production strategy of choice in these harsh environments where drought is a normal occurrence. And rather than being a coping strategy, pastoralism as a system is actually a strategic way for managing climate risks, livestock disease, conflicts, and other uncertainties. Some have used the term modern and mobile to reflect the fact that, in fact, pastoralism is always changing. It's not stuck in any particular traditional mode. And that, you know, pastoral livestock trade, despite the challenges of climate change and other challenges, in fact, in many areas, pastoralist livestock trade is in fact booming. And you have exports, for example, from the Horn of Africa to the Middle East. And many pastoralists are sophisticated and modern traders who are innovating and using modern technologies. Nonetheless, we have to recognize that these areas are undergoing rapid change. So we see, for example, in northern Kenya, and Hussein and I will talk about this, the development of renewable energy schemes. Elsewhere in these areas, we see the conversion of land that was traditionally used as rangeland to irrigated cropping or to other forms of land use. The picture there on the bottom lower left is of oil drilling in Turkana. We also see booming, demographic change. We see towns that were previously small market towns becoming sizable market centers. And also we have the policy context. We also have the drive towards enclosure, be it for irrigation, but also for conservation and other schemes. So I was interested, I suppose, in what were the dominant discourses, narratives around pastoralism found within policies in Kenya and Africa, and whether these have changed over time. Who are the principal actors and institutions shaping those policies, and what were their interests? And then ultimately, what are the outcomes or consequences for pastoralist livelihoods from the kind of policy prescriptions or solutions that flow from these narratives? To do this, I used an analytical framework that it's not new. It was developed originally by Keeley and Scoons and developed by others, which looks at the overlap or how would you say, the dynamic between discourses and narratives on the one hand, actors and their interests, and the broader political economy context. And within this, we find what are called policy spaces that may open up or close down depending on how these different factors interact. Now, I'm obviously touching on this, we could go in at much greater detail. I also came from a political ecology perspective, but again, that's another day's work to explain what I mean by that. In terms of the research design, well, it was a comparative case study. We're looking at two countries with sizable drylands and pastoralist populations with a lot of similarities, but also some important political differences. And this allowed me to compare and contrast the results. I used content analysis and discourse analysis of a sample of climate change and drylands development policies over a 10-year period in each country between, I think, 2007 and 2018. And I also followed this up with extensive semi-structured interviews with key informants from a range of policy actors, sectors, and perspectives. So government, NGOs, researchers, and so on. These are just a small sample of some of the documents I looked at from the Ethiopian. You can see there that not only are there sort of national development strategies, such as the Growth and Transformation Plan, but you also have more sector specific, like the Ethiopia Livestock Master Plan, and then some of the climate change adaptation policies and these green economy or climate resilient green economy strategies that are shaping Ethiopia's development trajectory. Similarly for Kenya, a similar range of policy documents. Okay, so all of these were looked at in detail. What were the findings? Well, what I found was, well, there was evidence of new thinking. When I talk about new thinking, I mean, kind of bringing to bear what some of the dryland scholars and so on have been talking about for years around the inherent resilience and adaptive nature of pastoralism. But the document analysis also revealed that the overarching discourse was one of transformation or transforming pastoralism and pastoral areas into something else. And this remained dominant, if slightly less so in Kenya. And within this discourse, often simplistic and depoliticized crisis narratives of resource scarcity, conflict-ridden drylands, and climate-induced pastoralist vulnerability are very much to the fore. And I would argue that these somehow amplify the perception that some kind of intervention needs to take place. So opening up space for the state or other actors, private sector, to claim control over resources previously managed under customary institutions. So in a way, there's inevitable consequences then for communities. So I could obviously talk about any of these documents in detail, but if we just look at one document in Ethiopia, I'm just using just one example here. As I say, I have many examples. This is the Ethiopian National Adaptation Plan, the most recent one from 2017. And they talk about pastoralism very much as a short-term coping mechanism, no longer sufficient in the face of climate change. And this, again, this need to build resilience and the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities. So pastoralism is also always associated with vulnerability. And unlike some set regional state adaptation plans that I also looked at, there's no reference at all to what I would call the non-climatic drivers of vulnerability. You know, the fact that other forces are having an impact on pastoralism, or indeed to pastoralists' own agency. And then if you look, so that identifies the problem. So typically crisis narratives then have policy prescriptions. And from what I could see from most of these documents, the emphasis is very much on technical solutions, you know, improve livestock breeding, improve rangeland management, value chain, commercialization of agriculture, improve early warning systems, livestock insurance, and so on. All good and sound, but again, very technical and perhaps prioritized over maybe more human rights or land governance issues. And I suppose if, in many cases, this goes back a long time in these areas historically, but if drylands are perceived or deliberately framed as somehow empty or unproductive, in other words, pastoralism needs to commercialize, or it didn't have markets. Of course, there were always markets there, and that pastoralism is no longer viable in the face of climate change, as many of these documents would argue, then it follows, it gives a strong argument to the conversion of these lands to other forms of land use, be it irrigated cropping, resource extraction, renewable energy, or wildlife conservation. In other words, what's the point of defending pastoralism if it's no longer viable? So in both cases, in Kenya and in Ethiopia, the desire to change, transform, to commercialize, to integrate dryland resources into the broader economy is, I would say, driven by an ideology of market-based economic growth and modernization, notwithstanding a mediation role for the central state, particularly in Ethiopia. And the imperative of climate change, meanwhile, has provided a new language to policymakers to reframe growth as an opportunity to build a green economy and to redefine the role of the state. In terms of actors and their interests, again, I'm really just touching on some findings here. We see that government actors in both countries have, you know, will tend to, the ones I spoke to tend to frame pastoral areas and pastoralism. Again, this very much around vulnerability, around conflict, and prescribe largely apolitical technocratic solutions. So matching the discourse and content analysis of the policy documents. Non-state actors, on the other hand, and what I refer to as non-state actors, these could be donors, it could be NGOs, it could be pastoralist organizations themselves, tended to use metaphors and narratives more usually associated with what I call a pure pastoralist or a modern and mobile discourse, pointing more towards the appropriation of critical rangeland resources as undermining pastoralists' inherent adaptive capacity. In other words, climate change is happening, but it's not the biggest issue. It's the fact that pastoralists can no longer perhaps move around in the way they did in the past. So for donors, I guess there was an assumption that by incorporating pastoralists into the market economy was necessary for pastoralists to somehow adapt to climate change. And I just use one example there. Just then to move on to policy consequences. So I guess while these changes, well, there are many changes in pastoral areas, you know, growing population, growing economies and so on. And there are multiple factors, and not just a result, obviously, of policy making, but it is evident that narratives of food insecurity and climate vulnerability are being used by the state and other actors to make decisions around changes in land use that will justify the appropriation of formerly communally owned rangeland in pastoralist areas. And in some cases, in Ethiopia, for example, sedentarization, the settlement of pastoralist communities, be it voluntary or even enforced in some cases, is given justification by these arguments. So as a result, we see further infrastructure development, we see the drive for green energy that Anna Hussein will talk about, which brings benefits to these areas, but also leads to tensions and displacement around, I guess, who are the winners and losers from these developments. And in some cases, we've seen interventions that have actually led to human rights issues, to displacement, particularly in the lower Omo Valley people might be familiar with that, where formerly rangeland or land used by agropastoralists has been converted to sugar plantations and irrigation schemes. And I suppose my findings really just reaffirm what has been documented extensively elsewhere in the literature. So we know that mobility, which is the key pastoralist strategy, is being displayed. So just to conclude this presentation, or to conclude some of the key findings from my own research, what I found was that old narratives around vulnerability, around unproductivity, around food insecurity, around conflict are remarkably persistent, despite all the new language and the thinking around pastoralism and rangeland ecology. And some of the policies and actions to address climate change or build resilience will in themselves create new disparities, as well as consolidate existing ones, as different actors and interest groups seek to take advantage of these new investment opportunities that are opening up in the rangeland areas. At the same time, we need to recognize that pastoralism remains a flexible and dynamic system that continues to adapt in the face of uncertainties. And pastoralists in Ethiopia, as in Kenya, are adapting their livelihood activities in order to coexist with the kinds of changes in land use taking place around them. So ultimately, the challenge is to enable pathways that allow the development imperatives of the state to be met in a way that does not undermine the rights of pastoralists to land and other resources, and which affords more agency and voice to pastoralists and policy-making processes that affect them. Climate change thus offers an opportunity for renewed focus on pastoralist areas, and but also to really move beyond just recognition of pastoralism and to really provide new supports around land governance issues, protecting rights, recognizing local and diverse contexts, and recognizing that some groups will benefit more than others, and how do you protect those groups that perhaps don't have such a strong political voice. And so those are just a few thoughts and insights from my own research, and I'll stop talking now, but be glad to answer any questions or have discussion with you later. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. And while our guest speakers are loading their presentation, I just want to introduce you once again. We have in the second part of the presentation, we have Dr. Anne Waters-Beyer and Dr. Hussein Tadicha Wario. And they're going to talk to how the rangelands in Africa and elsewhere are increasingly being targeted as a new frontier for renewable green energy investments, and what this means for pastoralists and what can be done to manage a just transition. So I'm delighted to hand over to them now for their presentation. And as I said, this is a joint presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I see I have to get out to be able to put on my computer. Now I can go back in. I brought it up too soon. Okay.
Can you go to slideshow, Anne?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. So thank you very much, Kieran, for the introduction. And yes, Hussein and we did this study together on how the expansion of large-scale green energy has affected pastoralists. And as you have heard already from Tom, in the past, most of the national governments gave actually little value to the dry lands, regarded them as marginal and low potential. But now, the global climate crisis and the need to make a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is giving new value to these vast open spaces where this energy can be produced. Now, these dryland areas have been used by pastoralists for generations, but the investors often ignore the rights of these traditional land users and offer them little or no compensation or benefits when their land is used to produce energy. So the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, that's a foundation affiliated with the German Green Party, commissioned this study on how large-scale green energy projects affect pastoralists, and it had two aims. One was to stimulate policymakers to shape the expansion of the green energy production in the drylands so that it does no harm. And the second was to help pastoralists and wider civil society become better prepared to deal with this expansion. So in this study, Hussein and I focused on a large-scale land acquisition to invest in solar and wind power, not hydropower. And we looked at issues of climate justice and human rights, and we also explored the possibilities of coexistence of pastoralism and green energy. The study was it was on a global literature review. We examined a few cases in more detail. You can see here the countries in which those cases were. And Hussein, who lives in northern Kenya, he also interviewed some stakeholders there. And in a few minutes, he'll tell you a bit more about that. So what is the current state? What are the trends in the energy sector? Solar and wind power production is expanding quickly worldwide in efforts to meet the global demand for carbon-free energy and the national commitments made in the Paris Agreement to reduce CO2 emissions. Several countries have set targets for 100% renewable energy by 2030. That's 8 years from now. Some of this energy will be used to produce green hydrogen to meet the increased demand for e-fuels for industry and transport. The governments and investors have recognized that the drylands are excellent sites for producing solar and wind power. They've got high solar irradiation, often high wind velocities. They tend to be fairly flat and are sparsely populated. Green energy projects close to cities often face resistance from the inhabitants who have more influence than do people in the drylands. So we found in India, Kenya, Morocco, and Norway, there were cases where large-scale green energy projects were set up in the drylands without adequate consultation with the local land users and without their free, prior, and informed consent. Most pastoralists graze their herds on common property, land that the state holds in trust for its citizens. But the state often did not honor traditional land rights. It used the narratives of which Tom was speaking, the narratives of making unused and degraded land productive to justify land grabbing for environmental purposes, so-called green grabbing. Investors acquired large areas for green energy projects. They were blocking livestock access, fragmenting the grazing areas, hindering herd movements. And this constrained pastoralists' ability to be resilient to climate change. Now, mobile pastoralism is the most viable agricultural production system in the drylands. But many governments don't know what they're destroying. They greatly underestimate the value of pastoralism in terms of low external input food production and ecosystem services, and they therefore give little value to this land use. And this puts pastoralists in a weak position to negotiate continued use of the land or compensation for its loss. In most cases, during project planning, the pastoralists were not well informed, if at all, about the plans or their own rights, and were not well organized to defend their land or to negotiate terms. Now, when solar farms with ground-mounted panels were set up, the herders lost access to all of the pasture beneath and between the panels. In the case of wind farms, in principle, they should interfere less with grazing, as the turbines have a relatively small footprint in the wider landscape. But in most cases, the herders felt that their land and cultural rights had been violated, and they therefore started to resist the projects. Now, one such case is the Lake Turkana wind power project in northern Kenya, where the pastoralists took it to court, and Hussein will tell you more about that. And also late last year in Norway, a court ruled that the licenses issued by the government to erect wind turbines on land used by Sami herders violated the Samis' civil and cultural rights, as it interfered with their protected cultural practices of reindeer herding. The Sami demanded that the turbines be torn down, but they're still standing. The dispute continues. Thus, many green energy projects have led to lose-lose situations. The customary land users lost access to pasture and water and their main source of energy, firewood. Their herd migration routes were cut, and the resilience of their overall land use system, pastoralism, was decreased. In conflicts with local people, many of the energy companies experienced damaged infrastructure, construction delays, higher costs, and even complete project failure. But in most cases, the biggest losers have been the pastoralists. If human rights principles and legal systems for recognizing rights to common property resources are not applied, a growing number of pastoralists will lose their land to green energy projects and will become poorer. They will become more, involved in more conflict. They will become hopeless and they will emigrate. And it would be the height of climate injustice. However, we also found a few cases where good consultation processes were carried out and the energy company and the local community reached agreement on shared use of the land in Mexico and in northern Canada, and also in one case in Kenya. Local communities benefited from the green energy projects through receiving equity shares in the company and managing community trust funds fed by energy revenues. Moreover, scientific studies have shown that green energy production can coexist with grazing and can even improve animal welfare. For example, solar panels and wind turbines, as you see here, can provide shade for livestock. However, the cases of coexistence we found were mainly in the USA and Australia, where pastoralists are ranchers with private land ownership or leases. They could negotiate directly with the energy companies, and the situation is much more complex in countries where pastoralists use common property resources and normally have no legally recognized title to the land and the water that they're using in different seasons. And Hussein will now tell you about the situation in one such country in Kenya.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Hussein Wario. I'm the Director for Center for Research and Development in Drylands, a local non-profit organization based in northern Kenya. I will pick up from where Anne has left off to present to you a case example of pastoralism and a large-scale green energy project in the Kenyan drylands. And I will also complete the presentation by providing recommendations and conclusions at the end of it. To begin with, before going into this experience, I will first like to briefly introduce you to northern Kenya. The region falls within the Kenyan drylands, often referred to as arid and semi-arid lands, which comprise over 80% of Kenya's landmass. As you can see on the map on the right, the brown and the cream areas. The main economic stay of the people of the ASEAN areas is livestock rearing through pastoralism, which uses natural growing forage to produce high quality livestock products. Although the region produces the bulk of meat consumed in the country and supports millions of people, it was marginalized by the colonial and independent governments and has remained underdeveloped relative to other parts of the country. In the last decade, however, following constitutional changes in 2010 that brought in developed form of governance, there has been improvement of infrastructure, and this has opened up the region's potentials and has increased investments interest in the region. And then with this interest, definitely, it brings in increased investment interest on land. Next slide, Anne, please. So this has heightened.
What's that?
Is it not moving? Next slide, please. Yes. Yes. This has increased investment interest on land, and its acquisition for large-scale projects. Generally, land governance system in Kenya is challenged by rampant corruption and illegal acquisitions, which have resulted in high levels of inequalities in land ownership in the country. This has made land to be central to conflict in the country. In northern Kenya, communities lacked framework for owning land. It was held in trust by the government, which meant that the land could be acquired, with limited or no consultation of the community that depended on it. Over the past 15 years, however, Kenya has initiated various legal reforms, which is related to land, aimed at addressing the inequalities and also reduce the conflict that it bred. So in this effort, Kenyan drylands have also benefited from a law, that is the Community Land Act, that provides a framework for communities to register their land, but its implementation has been slow. Thus, we still have illegal acquisitions continuing. And now it is in this backdrop now that we talk about this green energy development. And for the Lake Turkana, it was sort of accidental that two Dutch entrepreneurs on holiday stumbled upon a strong wind corridor while camping in Lake Turkana area. And the idea for a wind project was hatched. The process of land acquisition for this project was initiated in around 2007. And because the land was under the trust of the then local government, as the Marsabit County Council, it was acquired with limited involvement of the community. The land, of course, has been used for pastures by various pastoralists, that is Turkana, Samburu, Rendile, and El Molo herders, who are not consulted in this acquisition. Construction of this began around 2014, and it was completed after 5 years. The project currently generates about 310 megawatts of electricity, which is purchased by the Kenyan government at the cost of about $70 million per year. Communities in the area benefited only from minimal or limited job opportunities and a few small projects under corporate social responsibility. So this now led to some resistance. So besides the questionable land acquisition, the project did not live up to the expectation and the promise of, the economic transformation that the project was expected to bring, or the developers initially presented to the community. The community therefore expressed displeasure over a number of issues, which included, lack of consultation that we have already mentioned. Only few leaders who sit within the council were involved in the decision. And even though the land, as unregistered land, belongs to the community, the acquisition transferred the land ownership, from being communal to private. So the investors were given a title to the land. The community regarded the process as irregular in the view of the land laws, even at the time, because the allocation was done by then a town planning committee, which even by the law of the time, which is the Trust Land Act, there was need for setting up of a divisional land board that will have included community members in its representation. Also, there was no compensation for the land. So because it was regarded rather empty land and investable, terra nullius. Moreover, the company acquired 60,700 hectares of land, yet it only used 16,107 hectares of land. So community were wondering or questioned the need why that extra almost 40,000 was acquired for this project. Also, in such projects, according to the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People, there are certain laid out principles needed to be followed. In this case, the indigenous people's policies were not triggered because Kenya has not ratified the UN REAPS framework. However, the communities rightfully regard themselves as indigenous peoples. So there's loss of access to cultural site, for example, by the Rendile community for an important ceremony. And also one other grievance was the fact that when the power started being generated and up to now, the areas there have not benefited from this power. And also there are some additional benefits, for example, in form of carbon credits, which go up to also $10 million per year, that does not benefit the community, but rather goes to the national level investments. So representatives of the community went to court even at the onset of this project. And of course, by 2009, before any decision was made, already 365 turbines were already erect and feeding power to the national grid. However, after almost 6 years, in late 2021, the court ruled that the land acquisition process for the wind park has been illegal, but then the wind park was already in full operation, as we've said. So the court recommended that the acquisition be regularized, which meant that the company should obtain a legal title. Of course, despite this exceptional win for the community, they were not happy with the court's decision, which, in their opinion, was just legalizing the illegality. They demanded that the land title be revoked and fresh negotiations started. Also, the court rejected the committee's plea that the operation of the wind farm be stopped until a new agreement is reached. So that's the situation now with the pastoralists and the green energy in the area. Of course, the conversation continues on how the land is to be regularized and the pastoralists to benefit. There are more such cases, and most of them do not even reach the courts. An effort to seek justice, for these local pastoralists continues. And with this now, in this study, we looked at how can just transition be facilitated. So we have recommendations for policymakers in countries where green energy projects are being set up, as well as in energy importing countries like Germany. For example, the framework for procuring and certifying renewable energy, including green hydrogen, should require that it come from projects that meet global human rights standards. We also make recommendations for energy companies and investment banks. But today, however, we highlight the recommendations for civil society organizations and researchers with a view of protecting pastoralist lives and helping them gain evidence to strengthen their position and negotiation for green energy. Looking at recommendations for the community-based organizations, we indicate that CSOs, including pastoralist organizations, should become familiar first with existing international standards and codes of business conduct and exert pressure on governments and investors to adhere to them. Secondly, they need to strengthen pastoralist capacities to negotiate with green energy projects, e.g. in claiming community land rights to their traditional land and gaining access to legal advice and independent conflict mediation. They also need to advocate for policy changes to secure pastoral communities' resource use rights, as well as facilitating multi-stakeholder planning processes for land use that includes both pastoralism and green energy. We do also have some recommendations for researchers, and we say that the researchers should fill knowledge gaps on multifaceted value of pastoralism and drylands, generating the data together with pastoralists and making the data easily accessible to them for their own use. Researchers also need to engage in participatory action research with pastoralists facing energy projects to eliminate the socioeconomic impacts and enable pastoralists legal empowerment. And finally, researchers need to engage in participatory action research to find ways to integrate green energy and grazing. In conclusion, therefore, as the world urgently needs energy transition, green energy production will expand still further into the drylands. Here, the challenge is to find how climate injustice to pastoralists can be prevented. Inclusive participatory design of energy projects within multifaceted or multifunctional land use could optimize overall land use efficiency for pastoralism, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and rural economic activities and energy production. This could create win-win situation for pastoralists and green energy, but only if the voice and agency of pastoralist communities are strengthened so that they can negotiate good terms for coexistence and co-benefits with energy investors. Government needs to manage energy transition carefully in open discussion with well-informed civil society, and especially the pastoralists. Only then can damage to their rights and livelihoods be averted, and equitable transition to renewable energy can be made. So with that, we say thank you very much, and I'll end mine there. Thank you so much. for the attention.
Excellent, excellent, Hussein. You're absolutely kept to the time, you and Anne, and I'm delighted that we now have some time for questions or reflections. I have some in mind myself, but perhaps, Tom, in your experience or in your presentation, is there any points that you'd like to clarify or amplify before the chat function opens?
No, I think Kieran, open it up and see if there's any points from the floor, and I can certainly respond. Or
okay, sure.
Hussein, I think that the two presentations, work well together. So I'd be interested to hear if people have further insights from their own experience or knowledge.
As I said in the chat there, if you could introduce yourself as well, just to say who you are and where you're based, prior to any comments. Personally, my own reflections on this, and I come to this as a novice, but I am curious from around the second presentation, was there evidence of community benefits? I know that in the likes of Denmark, and it's been discussed here in Ireland as well, that the local community would receive, a certain allowance of electricity or a certain reduction in their energy costs. Was this a feature of your studies at all?
Hussein, I think that would be very good for you to answer in that particular case in Kenya. I mean, there are also answers from other areas, but you have that specific case.
Yes, thank you, Karen. And the specific case that we came across in this review in Kenya, and that is in southern parts of Kenya, where similarly, company established a wind project. And this one is called Kipeto Wind Farm. It started generating power about a year and a half ago, I think, from the documents. And in this one, we see that there was a bit quite systematic way of, community entry, first looking at where the project is going to be established, where the power lines are going to pass, and where the turbines are going to be erected. And also in this one, of course, the exception is that this land is already registered as a group ranch. So the community here also, compared to the ones that we present here in Lake Turkana, advanced in terms of their land rights and being able to negotiate with investors. So in this one, we see that there was quite elaborate discussion between investors and with the government, and we see various benefits laid out. And these include, for example, in case of relocation, the family is relocated and a house built for them at a site of their choice. And also the community were to get a certain percentage of the profit that the company makes. And that, at that particular times value goes to around $1 million US, that is 100 million shillings for the community. And then the individuals were on whose land, the turbines were erected, also were getting a fraction of what is made from that turbine. And also there was also element of equity, the community being put as owners, having shares sort of in the company. And then also there, of course, these other what is called corporate social responsibility projects, renovation of schools, health centers, roads, for example. And that is now the kind of benefit that we see in around Lake Turkana are those ones, not really those tangible ones that goes to the community directly, but basically rehabilitation of health facilities. Police stations, for example, is what is rehabilitated in that area. So these are the differences that we see in this project. And is there any other benefit maybe I have forgotten that
well, no, I think one thing that would be important to add is in the case that we did find in Kenya, where the community then did get some benefits through Community Trust Fund, it was after a very, very long time of conflict and destruction of some of the equipment of the company. And then the company realized it had gone about it the wrong way and tried to do it differently and was successful. And in the other cases that Hussein was talking about, such as the one up in Turkana, they didn't learn so quickly. And of course, they completely misunderstood the cultural situation there, where you have 4, 5, 6 different pastoralist groups that have different claims on the land culturally. It's a very complex situation.
Absolutely. And I can imagine it can be very divisive for communities. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Between communities.
Yeah, intra.
Yeah.
Some questions and comments are popping up there. I see from Arena, who says that, thank you, Hussein and Tom. Just to add to Hussein and Anne's presentation, the energy transition, which should be a just transition, is about managing contradiction. And your presentations highlight these contradictions very well. Thank you for this, Hussein and Anne. And then Anna Seidel from University of Hohenheim.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Germany, yeah.
Germany,
Yeah.
yes, excellent. Currently based in northern Kenya. Do some candidates for political positions in Marsabit County mention their vision for Marsabit County in terms of energy development projects?
Yeah, I can quickly respond to that.
Just before you go into that, can I ask people to turn on their cameras? Maybe that might be, we're a small enough group, and just to make it a little bit more intimate. Would that be possible if you could turn on your cameras? If it's
Right. Good. Yeah.
Now, Hussein, thank you.
Yes, I thank you, Anne. I think Anne, we met a while back, and I know she's doing her work in northern Kenya. For the politicians, in a way, yes. For example, the case that we have just stated for the Lake Turkana, the case started at a time, when there was a campaign, in a campaign period, and there was a group who assisted the community now in, finding a lawyer and supporting, movements between courts and their settlements. And this way, they supported the process. But currently, as we speak, we don't hear a lot of that happening because there was a win. So everybody think that is the end. It was pronounced that the land acquisition is illegal and negotiations have to happen, how to regularize. And there's basically no conversation on how, what has been wrong or the wrongs that have been committed can be corrected. And we don't hear that a lot. It's only at the pronunciation of this court ruling, we saw a group of politicians doing a press statement saying that now this has happened, we need more jobs for our people. They straight went on to not really focusing on, what are the impacts and how can communities benefit, not just in the long term, but in the long term, not in the short term, but in the long term, and making sure that, the transition is smooth and there's win-win situation for both. So there's this short-sightedness that we see in instances also where politicians join, the voices. They basically look at how can I make 1 or 2 gains, political gains out of it. And the group that supported them at the beginning are not even talking about it now. They're not looking at now that we have reached this stage, what next and how can we treat this better? And one key thing, as also Anna has pointed, the situation is so complex. So many small communities live in this area. They are not coordinated. Each one of them see, the impact from their own perspectives, and each one wants, to front their case as they were, and they cannot be heard that way. So having that organized front is what, again, is limiting the conversations. Of course, we have some civil society organizations starting conversations recently. One is Friends of Lake Turkana, that call people together just to map and say, now that we are here, what next? So that is how the situation is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hussein. And Tom, Arena, you have put a question in the chat there. I think it links with local politics as well. Would you like to
see that, Kieran? Yeah, I mean, again, no, I didn't look specifically at cross-border migration between Kenya and Ethiopia, but I am aware of it, and there is research and thinking around that. And I suppose, as we know, national borders are not something that, you know, pastoralists have traditionally recognized, but these borders are another form of restriction on mobility. But there is people working on you know, protocols to try and open up and recognize the importance of movement. Yeah, but I mean, obviously, like pastoralists, for example, if there's a drought in southern Ethiopia, they could move to Kenya or vice versa. And if these restrictions are there, then people are exposed to the, you know, impacts of climate change, and that's where we see the kind of negative images, then the results of that. Whereas in the old days, people could move to these what were called you know, drought reserves, if you like. So it's just another form of restriction. And I mean, it's a huge issue, but there are, and even at the highest level, the FAO and stuff, and Anne might know better than I, there are a number of initiatives, and within the region, the organization of East African states and so on are looking at and recognize the importance, particularly, you know, we see the effects of COVID where there was a lot of restrictions. And so these traditional migration routes might have been closed down, and that has impacts, as I say, for food security and livelihood security. But yeah, it's a very important area.
I had a quick question. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Evan?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Evan. I was recently a DVM MPH student at Tufts, and now I'm actually starting my PhD at Tufts in the fall with a focus on One Health policy in pastoral areas. So very exciting. And thanks so much for your talk this morning. I'm wondering about sort of the intersection between community or indigenous governance systems and the sort of more established government systems coming from the national level, and how sort of traditional forms of governance, which were basically rangeland management, are intersecting with, you know, this top-down kind of policy of governance, and how that plays into these, I mean, not just the sort of green energy development, but obviously a lot of interactions between pastoralists and you know, the sort of policy actors that they're interacting with.
To whom is your question posed? Is to all three of us? Or what?
Yeah, I guess if anyone has any thoughts. Sorry, that was kind of big, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I know that there have been over the past decades all sorts of efforts to try to have a better understanding from the outside of indigenous forms of governance among pastoralists, and to see how they can be linked up with governance coming from atop. Farm Africa was for a while actually very much involved in this in Ethiopia, but especially in Ethiopia, I did not see a great deal of progress actually being made in that. It seemed to be very difficult to make them compatible. I don't know how it is, Hussein, in Kenya, to what extent the traditional forms of governance are still effective. I mean, you are from your Borana background, you can maybe bring that.
Yeah, thanks, Griffith. And just to say, the traditional institutions that are there, you know, the main thing that they were able to do even before is to facilitate negotiations between communities, you know, that making sure that communities can move from one area that run by a certain community to the other. So these other forms of governance, you know, administrative issues that came in is a bit foreign, and it came in with, you know, other different form of powers and controls that are there. And these institutions, from the word go, they were not sort of recognized, you know, within these administrative cycles that we had. So a lot of times we see their powers that these traditional institutions had usurped by authorities, you know, that it's the government now that allows someone, you know, to move. The chief, for example, is the one that is in charge of allocation, who can say, certain pastoralists should not come to my location. And that shows that now, whatever they had in terms of negotiation powers with their neighbors is now sometimes overruled. But we also see cases, of course, where such administrators work with communities to be able to work. But what we see more also, as Anna has also said, is there's a bit of hybridization of these institutions that we have seen with local and non-governmental organizations, in the sense that there's bringing together these formal and the informal institutions, writing of governance rules, regulations based on the traditional, and also bringing in what does not contradict with Kenyan laws, for example, but also referring to laws that are there in the country. There's laws that governs water, forest, for example. These needed to be adhered to. One institution, of course, that talked about a lot around here, the Boran institutions of Leda, was one that was seen to be working. But after some time, we could also say that because of interferences from political perspectives, from inter-ethnic conflicts, it also gets a lot of challenges to move into the complex dynamics of management of resources. And mobility forms also changes. People used to move by, they used to move livestock. But now you can see that livestock are brought by lorries or trucks, and the normal negotiations that they come, slowly discuss with people is not there. And more power with money also influences all this dynamics. So there's all these complexities that are there that makes it challenging for the traditional institutions to really move into this transition. Also, the same with the green energy, it becomes complex and that perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Thanks.
I have a question for Hussein again, and perhaps Anne, with regards to this issue. I come from a mediation, conflict intervention in violent conflict background, and I'm just curious about the extent that this is reaching into that facet of society. Or is it a contributory factor to other divisions that can lead to violent conflict?
And did you get that right? I didn't get it clearly. Karen, sorry.
I must admit, I was also not quite clear. I think it's something to do with the mediation tools or mediation approaches, and to what extent they are being applied in these situations with green energy and pastoralism. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. And also the potential for violent conflict in this context.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that Hussein can speak a lot about that, because he's right in the midst of it right now. Maybe I should just let you go ahead, Hussein, when I see what the time is. Okay.
Yeah, the time is, yes. Karen, I think it's that the station is kind of similar, with institutions that manage natural resources and the ones that manage these negotiations in terms of conflict. We also see in Kenya, for example, this hybridization is what we see a lot, because there's a law or from the central government, that communities need to be involved, in conflict resolutions, and then they co-opt now elders, what they call peace committees, for example, who are now trained, in mediation and be able to discuss among themselves and through facilitation, of course, of, for example, non-governmental organizations or the government. And we see, these similarities within different contexts. In environmental management, we have environmental management committees, for example, grazing management committees. So all this, just giving the example of Kenya, there's a bit of experimentation of trials to link them up with the governance or the country's governance, government laws and policies to see how things are worked out at the local level. However, what we see is that it doesn't always work well, because when you talk about these committees, there's these not natural leaders or the community leaders who are respected who come up, but people who have opportunities, you know, to hear about this and be able to join these conversations are the ones who join these committees or these hybrid institutions. So what we'll call, you know, the natural or the leadership at the local level might entirely not be involved, but rather we can say just some gatekeepers who are quite active and be able to, you know, transit and discuss issues with at that level are the ones who get the platform to engage.
Okay, so we're into the last couple of minutes now. Does anybody have a final comment or a question for our panel? Or
I was just curious, Kieran, if Anne and Hussein, in your research, if you looked at geothermal, because that's also a big area for renewable energy development in Kenya, I understand, in the Rift Valley, and has also been contentious, you know, for example, in where areas where Maasai communities would have lived. Or is that a different study?
Well, we did cover a couple of pieces of literature about geothermal energy, and those cases indeed were in Kenya. But Hussein, I think because Hussein focused on the Kenyan case, I think in your review you focus mainly or only on the solar and wind energy, is that right? Or are you now expanding, because you're doing more research on this now, are you expanding into the geothermal energy and pastoralism?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yes, in that initial study, we did mainly on solar and wind, but now we are looking at expanding into also geothermal, and the cases of illegal acquisitions, land being purchased, you know, without the knowledge of the communities themselves and sort of leased to companies is what we could see also with the geothermal, and also, you know, the powers that be, the government and some of the government officers, you know, being able, you know, being privy to even development of these projects much before the community are aware of, acquiring land and selling to companies or leasing to companies is phenomenon that we see. And also the same way as what we've talked about, like Turkana, communities not getting compensations, being in some cases actually forcefully removed from sites that for submarine geothermal are some of the things that we've seen in the literature, but it's not in this report, but we'll cover that in part of what we're going to do soon also.
And an interesting phenomenon in Kenya and probably elsewhere, and maybe Hussein or Anne might know more obviously about this, is that because land is increasingly being so sought after and is being enclosed and outside investors are coming in, there's a phenomenon where perhaps wealthier communities within the pastoralist communities or within the northern ASAL areas are themselves enclosing areas as a form of defense. They feel if I don't enclose my land, somebody else will take it from me. So, you know, particularly with expanding towns, people will start to put up fences and so on. So this phenomenon of enclosure, it's a bit like Hussein was saying, things are complex, they're not, you know, they're overlapping, they're messy. There's so much different levels of politics going on, but it is interesting. So there's a lot happening. So certain groups, even within pastoralism, arguably they talk about the pastoralist elite, you know, are benefiting maybe from some of these new investments, you know, whereas others are losing out. So it's nothing is simple.
Well, that was certainly the case in some of the other countries, for example, in Morocco, and that kind of thing was coming up, that the elite was benefiting from the solar energy, but the normal people were not. Yeah,
and even though devolution in itself, everybody spoke about how it opens up new opportunities for participation in governance. In itself, it has also created divisions within society, you know, and along perhaps ethnic lines, where more dominant groups can exclude less, you know, the more marginal groups. But nothing is, I think Hussein made the point, you know, hybrid, messy, overlapping, complex. I think that's very much the situation on the ground. So there's a lot going on, but indeed it's very interesting.
But then the people that are coming in with the investors, they have to make the efforts to try to understand this situation.
Exactly.
And if they do not, then they are going to have a lot of conflict and a lot of costs and possibly failure of their projects.
Absolutely. There's lots of lessons to be learned here.
Can I clarify, just for my own information, to what extent have EGAD you know, attempted, I'm thinking about the beneficiaries of this electricity and where that is going. And is there any regional dimension to this? I'm thinking like in Europe where like France are generating a lot of electricity that's been sold to Germany, that's been sold to England, or to the UK, I should say. And, you know, the potential of it even been sold to Ireland. Does that happen at a regional level in East Africa?
Well, as far as I know, Hussein, you can correct me, but I think that the energy that is being generated thus far is being bought up, for example, in Kenya by the Kenyan government for use within Kenya, I think primarily, but the pastoralists themselves that are on the land where the energy is being produced often do not benefit from this, or if they are going to get any, it's at a high cost of energy that they cannot afford. Yeah? Now, this is going to change as there's, for example, the German government is really wanting to push on green hydrogen. And there we will need to go outside of Germany to be able to generate this. They're talking about the vast areas in the south, around the tropics and so, where this green energy can be produced. And this is where many more solar and wind energy and other forms of renewable energy are going to, that's going to become more. So, and that's going to be exported then to countries like Germany. But I don't think that EGAD has started to deal with this yet.
Yeah, I've not also come across this. What I've come across, of course, they have issues on land, for example, trying to, you know, sensitizing the countries on the need, you know, for this pastoralist land to be registered and to be managed sustainably. And of course, what happens at EGAD that I've seen is, of course, they come up with frameworks or protocols, you know, for governments to adopt at their level. And sometimes this adoption, it's left at the countries on, you know, political processes to pick up and action this. So they work at that level. So I haven't seen anything specific, of course, on green energy, as Anna said as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's 2:15 here in Ireland now, so we've come to the end of our deliberations. I want to thank you all for joining us from all over the world, obviously. And I particularly want to thank our speakers, to Tom for his presentation and for putting this together, to Anne for your input and your coordination and your insights into the global context, and to Hussein for that particular interesting case study on Kenya. And it's something that we're going to watch. I'm a novice in this area, and I really did learn a lot from listening to you all today. So I really want to express my gratitude to you, and also to you as an audience that have made contributions and asked questions and contributed as well. It makes it all worthwhile for us. So thank you very much. That's the conclusion for today. I'll now stop the recording.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. And